Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-bits on Business and Finance with me. With utter confusion and complexity prevailing in the GST law in India, and it being very clear to the government that a large number of GST taxpayers are in no position to be able to file their GST audit reports on time, the government has extended the deadline all over again. And if reports are to be believed, the government is again reviewing as to how to make the underlying GST forms more simpler and easy to comply with. If you look at GST as a law, it's a new law in the country. When the government introduced it, it had a clean slate. The law could have been introduced in a far more better manner, according to us, in a two-stage process. In the first stage, the GST law could have been more simpler, practical and robust, such that the business community would have easily understood it, accepted it, implemented it and adopted it. And after the GST law became a part of the business transactions and economy of India, then the government in stage 2 could have made the law far more extensive, far more sophisticated and complicated if this is what it wanted. Unfortunately, right from the beginning, the GST law has been a byzantine and complex one, and it has been such that it has actually discouraged ordinary taxpayers from coming into the GST fold. The reasons are many for this. An ordinary taxpayer does not have the resources to maintain all the paraphernalia that is needed to prepare records, books of accounts, etc. for complying with the GST law. The ordinary taxpayer also does not have the resources to engage the services of an expensive consultant to guide him on the provisions of the GST Act. And because of that, there is fear of penalty and prosecution being imposed for any kind of even the smallest unintentional violation that may take place by the taxpayer. And then, when the government has a provision where there are multiple overlapping forms and returns for the same data and transactions, there's always a suspicion in the mind of the taxpayer as to what is the motive behind the government insisting on these kind of overlapping and multiple forms for the same transactions. The fact is that these are the typical features of almost every business and corporate law in the country. These laws tend to be anti-business in attitude. They come with a suspicion of the taxpayer or the person concerned. The laws tend to be complex. They are difficult to understand. They need expensive consultants to be explained. And they all come with multiple returns and forms to be filed. And sadly, when those forms are not filed on time, despite government systems not working, despite the government's own infrastructure hanging up, despite that, the taxpayer is foisted with huge penalties and prosecutions which few of them can bear. E-filing is certainly needed, but when it comes with heavy penalties and prosecution on a day-to-day basis which are driven by the system, the taxpayers are bound to be discouraged from coming into the GST fold. That's been the case with almost every corporate and business law that we see. Take the Companies Act. We had a Companies Act which was of 1956 vintage. The law had become bulky, the law had become unwieldy, it had become difficult to manage because of numerous amendments and court cases which amended the law. The government rightly came with a new law in 2013. The new Companies Act was meant to be simpler, easier to implement, but then it came with suspicion. And when a law is anti-business, it is not going to be simple and easy to implement. The reality is that when the law is framed, they have in mind those few truant, delinquent, criminal businessmen who have violated the law. And because the law then is formulated with those in mind, the entire large population of corporates and their promoters suffer. That is what happened with the Companies Act also. The Companies Act 2013 is loaded with penalties and prosecutions. The law is primarily criminalized. For the smallest of violations, you can end up having prosecution being initiated in criminal courts. And because of that, today, a lot of entrepreneurs do not want to form companies which is not good for India. You ask any banker and he will actually tell you that he prefers the company format of business for business being conducted. And today we have a situation where businessmen shy away from forming companies, and rightly so. For the smallest of violations, they face heavy penalties, they face prosecutions, they are dragged to criminal courts. They are facing a situation where regulators like the Registrar of Companies under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, instead of being regulators, are more of investigators. They view the businessman with suspicion and they come up with rules, regulations, and forms which are also made of such kind. A promoter of every breed and pedigree is suspected and the law is formulated accordingly. And today, this attitude in the law has caused untold misery and immense damage to corporate India. This would have continued till a situation came when the government came up with regulations under which if you had not complied with your CSR regulations, you would be charged with penalty and the promoters would also be sent to jail. CSR in its essence, if we keep the law aside, is meant to be a voluntary act on the part of the company. A part of its profits must be spent for the good of society, and for this very provision, the government came up with the jail sentence. There could be a lot of reasons why CSR regulations are not complied by a company, and the government said, you go to jail. There was a UN cry. The business community came up in arms, and the government quickly withdrew these provisions wherein if you violated CSR regulations, you could also be jailed. The UN cry of the business community did not end there really. It was very clear that it was time to amend the Companies Act, which is a highly criminalized one in its approach. The Companies Act needed to be made simpler, it needed to be decriminalized. And thus at that point of time, the government set up a high-powered committee. A committee was set up in order to look into how to decriminalize the Companies Act, how to reduce the numerous provisions of penalty and prosecution which are there in it, which are clogging the courts today. You go to courts, lakhs of cases have been filed for the most frivolous and trivial violation by companies, and these are criminal cases. Courts are clogged today. This had become a huge bane for corporate India, and because of this, the compliance costs had gone up, corporates have been scared, and ease of doing business is certainly suffering. With this in mind, a committee was set up. The committee recently came up with its first set of recommendations, and it states the most obvious. It states that wherever there are procedural, minor or technical violations, particularly in the matter of non-filing of forms or returns, those have to be punished with civil punishment and not criminal action by way of a jail sentence. That's the minimum that needs to be done. The committee also said in its recommendations that 23 sections and provisions which provide for jail sentences must be replaced with compounding of fines. It also said in 11 sections, the fines need to be put in and jail sentences removed as a punishment for the promoters or directors of a company. And 7 sections, it said, are unwanted and must be deleted. The committee also recommended that the threshold for CSR must be increased because according to it, the present threshold is too low and it will only result in violations. These are the recommendations of a committee. They have not yet been accepted and implemented by the government. We hope the government does so. But if you go by the track record and anecdotal data, the government is often known to set up committees for simplifying laws, and after the report comes, the report gets junked. That's what recently happened with the new tax code that was suggested by the Direct Taxes Task Force, which was set up by the government with a lot of fanfare. The report came, it mentioned a lot of simplification of income tax law, and the report was junked. We really hope that does not happen in this case also, because what we are seeing at the moment in the country is laws which are so complex, which are so full of suspicion of the entrepreneur that they have become anti-business and businessmen are shying away from conducting business itself. The other irony of these kind of laws is, while they are extremely tough, yet criminals like Nirav Modi commit huge offences and manage to run away. And what we are seeing is Lakhs of ordinary, innocent businessmen are facing criminal courts because of some ordinary violation that took place in these laws, and for that, criminal punishment is what they are facing. We think this needs to be stopped, and for that, the Companies Act certainly needs to be decriminalized. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.